1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have no.
Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the Launchpad Space Podcast. I'm Paul Ring and I'll be your host as we explore science and spaceflight. Today's guest is the author of The New Guys, the historic class of astronauts that broke barriers and changed the face of space travel. Meredith Bagby, welcome to the Launchpad.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on. It's I've just really enjoyed the book, and to me it seems like it covers a not so often covered part of the of NASA. You know, it's a lot about the '60s, and things about the Challenger, Columbia disasters and stuff. But there's not a lot about the '70s and kind of the start of the shuttle program in that class.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, America loves the Apollo program, and why wouldn't we? And there are great heroes that come from that and from the Gemini program. But the New Guys were the first class of shuttle astronauts. And the shuttle program arguably, well, factually, was the longest space program we've ever run. And in a lot of ways, the most successful in the sense that it flew like 135 times and mostly flew successfully, obviously, with the exception of Challenger and Columbia, and helped build the International Space Station, which we still have, the Hubble Space Telescope, and was really a remarkable program. And you're right, the astronauts that started it are rarely kind of canonized in this way. So that was the attempt of the book, is to really take a look at these unsung heroes.
I think you mentioned it like maybe in the acknowledgments at the end of the book, but talk about what got you what started you on the road to write the book.
I mean, honestly, it was my fifth grade science teacher. So that was a long time ago. But he applied to be the teacher in space for the teacher in space program in the 80s, which of course Christa McAuliffe won. But we spent the year learning about NASA and traveling to the Cape. And when Challenger launched, we were out on the field. We were the school children out on the field watching. And so that explosion always made a big impact on me. And I always wondered, aside from the teacher in space, who else had died on that flight? And then as an adult and as a writer, I found out that 4 people who died on that flight were part of this remarkable class in 1978. And of course, that this class was the first class of shuttle astronauts. It was also the first time NASA hired women and people of color to be part of the astronaut program. So it was really a historic class with a lot of firsts. Like, as an example, Sally Ride, who was the first American woman to space, was in this class as well.
Would you say they're the most significant astronaut class since, like, maybe the Mercury 7?
I would agree with that. And what's so interesting about this class to me is that it was the beginning of modern space travel. And by modern space travel, I really mean that not just pilots get to go to space, not just military guys get to go to space, that regular folk, although they weren't regular, get to go to space. I mean, these were remarkable scientists, but they were civilians. A lot of them were civilians. They hadn't served in the military. And now, of course, with the commercialization of space and space tourism and our moonshot, we're definitely seeing a broader array of people getting to go. And so this was the first time, though, that anyone tried that.
Few characters that you follow kind of right through. I'm kind of starting off on kind of probably one of the most famous members of the class, Sally Ride. Her getting selected and then also being getting to the point where she's like so well respected that she's on being the only person who was on both investigation boards following the accidents, and as well as being part of the Augustine Commission. It's amazing to go through, and then of course there's the whole thing about her sexuality and dealing with that. It's quite the story. I haven't read and haven't gotten a chance to read Lynn Sherr's biography, but this is the most I've learned about her in a while.
Yeah. Yeah, Lynn's biography is fantastic, and of course, also, really helped me understand Sally and her character arc and what she went through. And when she started, when she applied to be an astronaut, she of course asked her former girlfriend, her first girlfriend, to give her a personal reference, which was very bold. I mean, it really wasn't possible to be gay and an astronaut at that time. And she was, of course, in the closet, and whether she was or wasn't gay at that time is up for debate. She ended up marrying Steve Hawley, who was a fellow member of her class, and only later having a relationship with a woman and only coming out posthumously. So, or posthumously. Sorry, I always get that word wrong. But anyway, it's something she struggled with while she was in the program for sure. And she was having an affair with a woman as she was going through the Rogers Commission. Right after right up to Challenger, I think she was considering leaving NASA and planning her exit because she knew she couldn't be gay there. She didn't have this relationship, and she was having an affair with a woman at that time. And so when Challenger happened, she really got pulled back into the program to do this duty, which was to investigate Challenger. And it was really hard on her. And, she spent that time, rolling up her sleeves and trying to figure out what happened. And it's really, commend her for, breaking the case, so to speak. I mean, she got the smoking gun document from an internal source at NASA that ended up really proving that NASA knew that these O-rings were a huge problem. So she was instrumental at the Rogers Commission. Then, of course, after the Rogers Commission, she did leave, and she joined her partner and got a divorce and the whole thing. So anyway, her story is pretty remarkable. It's quite cinematic in a lot of ways, a hero's journey. It was wonderful. It was very interesting to research and read about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've always had a lot of respect for her, but just some of the stuff that, as you say, she did behind the scenes and stuff was critical, not just for being critical of NASA, but also for possibly saving the program by just making sure they knew what was going on and nobody tried to kind of just push it under the rug. Another character you follow who's another enigma and another person with a biography that I have, but I haven't read yet, is George Abbey. He's kind of just another one of the one of the behind the scenes characters that I think that had such an impact on the program, not just from assigning crews, but also helping to pick the first female and black astronauts.
He is. Yeah, I loved. First of all, I loved meeting George. I went to the Kennedy. I went to JSC in Houston, and I met him at Frenchie's, which was the old hangout for all the astronauts. It's still there, and it's got a whole wall full of astronauts. And we had a lot of coffee and chatted about his time at NASA, and he was one of the great titans of NASA. I mean, he started during the Apollo era and finished out towards the end of the shuttle program, or towards the middle to end of the shuttle program, but always stayed involved. He was the flight director, which means he got to choose who went on flights, and he was the beginning and end of that decision. And so it was up to him to make history by choosing the first woman and the first African American to fly to space. And of course, that was a lot of responsibility, which he took very seriously. He also was a mysterious character. I don't think anybody, even now, when I talk to some of these astronauts who are in their 70s and 80s, they still don't understand how he made those decisions and still speculate on why. Some of the great things about George, he really understood the value of teamwork. He was able to choose. None of his astronauts ever failed. All of the new guys went to space. This was his first class that he chose. So he chose very well. And he could figure out who would work well together. And one of my favorite stories about George is, right before Sally's flight, he saw that she had these jitters and she was very nervous. And so he brought her first girlfriend to the beach house, which is where they kind of hung out before flights, to have a, little meeting or have a conversation to calm her nerves. And I think he knew that Sally was gay, and nevertheless put her in the spotlight. And I thought that was just a great testament to him and this idea that like everybody should be able to go to space, and he had the credentials, and what did it matter?
Right. Yeah, that was a surprising but really kind of touching story about him. Because, again, it's like a guy that could walk out with the astronauts, but nobody who knew who he was. I think the cover of his biography is one with, like, was it Joe Allen or something?
Yeah.
He's like holding a sign saying,
Yeah, it says unidentified, like NASA official. They called him Uno.
Yeah.
He was the guy, but yeah, exactly. He was like the guy behind the scenes, the Machiavelli of NASA, but in a good way.
Yeah. And he's kind of had, from what I understand, he's kind of a polarizing figure. I mean, some people love him, some people don't love him.
I think that's right. I definitely got different reactions depending on who I talked to about him. And I think, honestly, that was because he held so much power and people didn't really understand how he was making those decisions. And it was, for type A people who like to control their lives, it was very frustrating.
Oh, I could see that, yeah. And he ended up getting kind of pushed aside at the end, too, which was unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. I think Challenger Challenger shook up the whole agency and really forced NASA to look at how it was operating bureaucratically, because it was a bureaucratic failure, a lot of this stuff. And a lot of people left after Challenger. George held on for, I think, about a year and then left after Challenger. Of course, he comes back later on and was instrumental in the International Space Station, getting that up and running. But during the Challenger era, it was a tough time, and a lot of people left or got reassigned to headquarters and that sort of thing.
Oh, sure. I feel like I'm just reading off a roster of NASA personnel, but you found so many cool just storylines through the whole the story, the era that you were writing about. They were great. I mean, number one is Anna Fisher, who's first mother in space, one of the third woman in space, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, and she's like, she's someone who was striking to me as a young kid, just because she was pretty, but she was also so much more. ER doctor. She did so much stuff at NASA that it's just, from even being assigned to write the, to talk about the lack of, I don't know how to say it exactly, but but post Columbia,
right.
I'm sorry if you can say it better than I can.
Yeah, no, she was so. All of that is true about Anna. I mean, just to sort of reiterate some of the things you said, she was the first mom in space, and of course, one of the first 6 women in space. Her mission, the first one that she went on, was pretty extraordinary, and it's not well known, honestly, but it was the first time that people retrieved satellites. So before her flight, we had launched 2 satellites that they broke. They didn't perform, and they weren't able to get into their correct orbit. And so they went up and they pulled them out of the air. And that was the first time we'd ever done that, when they used the remote arm, and they did all kinds of crazy stuff, like grab them with their hands and pull them in. And this stuff, you're in space. They were improvising, but in a great way. And it was a remarkable mission. And anyway, so that was her first mission. And when she went on that mission, her child was only like a year old or something. I think she got her assignment while she was still pregnant. So it was really new territory for NASA to have a pregnant woman training for a flight, flying in T-38s. And then, a new mother saying goodbye to her little baby, and maybe living and maybe not living on this experimental vehicle. So all of that was very kind of exciting and tense. And anyway, but yes, you're right. After that flight, Anna went on to one of the longest careers at NASA. And she came back as an administrator, and she ran the International Space Station, the astronaut branch of the International Space Station. And so she was now training, astronauts to go up to the International Space Station. And she, went to Russia, and she did. So anyway, her career was very long, and she only retired. I think she retired after the shuttle. After the shuttle's wheel stop. And so she continued on into some of the Artemis program. And so hers is career. And the thing that you mentioned was, when Columbia happened in 2003, she was actually training to go back to space. And had she gone, she would have been the eldest person at that time and was her kind of second act in space. And right as that happened, Columbia exploded. And then instead of going to space, she had to investigate the Columbia accident. And she was on the committee that considered whether or not they should have tried to make a rescue mission, and came to the conclusion that they should have tried. And I think that was also a very hard thing for her to do, because she's investigating the people she works for and the people that helped make her career. So much like Sally, she's put in this position of being a critic of the program. Right. And she did so, and then continued on. She rolled her sleeves back up and went back to work.
Yeah, because it wasn't anything. I'm sure it wasn't anything against the, for the love of the program, you have, it's sort of like tough love to get kind of back on track. And I understand she was also training for a mission around the time Challenger happened too, which is kind of.
She was. It's ironic and strange, but that's actually, she was going up. For her second time, she was training, and she was doing the training module, I think, as Challenger was happening, and just finishing the module. She was taking a break and walking back to the office in Houston at the conference room where they all watched. And that's, when she saw it happen. But that kept her from flying the second time.
Yeah. So she was affected. Her ability to go back to space was affected by both disasters.
Exactly.
Marriages, as far as the new guys, I know there were a bunch that kind of suffered, or, there were a lot of divorces in the early space program. I haven't heard about a lot from the shuttle program. I don't know if that's just my ignorance, or, but I know her and Bill Fisher was one that didn't survive the program. If there were fewer, or does it seem like there were fewer marriage breakups?
I think there was. Yeah, I think there were. I haven't taken. To be honest with you, I haven't taken a survey, especially of the ones that I focused on were the ones, or the relationships that I focused on were the ones where people dated other astronauts in that class, and or other astronauts. And of course, Bill and Anna were a focal point of the book. Also, Ray and Hoot, who are still married, are a focal point of the book. And Sally and Steve are a focal point of the book. And of course, their marriage didn't survive, and Anna and Bill's didn't survive, although they, I think, divorced much later in the program after Bill left NASA. But it's hard. I mean, I know that I talked to Ray and Hoot about it, and Anna too, and they talked about how difficult it was to have two parents who were in the program, and when you were flying, you had to really step up as a parent. But it was hard because you were all potentially also training for your other, flight that was later on. So it was really difficult, and they had to let certain things go. Like the house was always messy, Ray said. And, they had luckily, I think, brought in support, whether it was parents or grandparents and that kind of thing. But for sure, they put some miles on the marriage.
Oh. Well, one of the reasons I asked is because one of my previous interviews was with Stacey Morgan, who wrote The Astronaut's Wife. She's Drew Morgan's wife, and she was talking about how dealing with issues in the home front when he was up in space for 9 months during the pandemic too, which kind of adds another little bit of cherry on top of the issues. But, I find it fascinating, and there seems to be a much better support system than there was in the 60s. But I was wondering where how things were in the gap in between times, the 70s and stuff. Of course, it wasn't as bad in the 70s because they weren't flying really until the 80s. So.
And the flights were relatively short. I mean, we didn't get into long stay duration until later on. Like it's interesting. Shannon Lucid, who we do talk about, who did a long-term stay on Mir, and at the time, I think she held the record. I think she held the record for any person or something like that in space. For a while, yeah, and she had luckily had grown children. She did it older in life. She was 50 something when she did it, and in a way, it was I think a little easier on her family. She didn't have young children, but the long duration stuff at the ISS is really tough on families for sure.
Well, speaking of Ray Seddon too, the chapter you did, and then there's a few other bits where you visited with Ray and Ron McNair, and their kind of the bond that was created with them, and being, from the South and kind of dealing with stuff together, but being from very different backgrounds apart from geographically. Can you tell me about that a little bit?
Yeah. So Ray and Ron were both from the South. And, Ron McNair, of course, grew up in an impoverished neighborhood in a segregated South, where Black people were not allowed at the library or in pools or at the public pools, and really fought his way out of those circumstances through education. When he got to NASA and he got into the training program, he couldn't swim because of that. And Ray, who had also grown up in the South and totally different background, white, more privileged background, but also a lot of stereotypes at the time about what women could and could not do, and had a very negative experience with swimming where a boy held her underneath the water and she felt like she was going to drown. So she didn't like swimming. And so the two of them really bonded over this, not being able to swim. But they had to be an astronaut. You had to be able to swim because they practiced underwater. All the spacewalks and working on the shuttle equipment was done underwater to simulate zero gravity. And so they needed to learn to swim. So they bonded over this. They kind of recognized their fear and the fear in each other pretty quick when they started having to do all the water related training, and, practice together at the public pool, until they could swim a length and go under and retrieve a brick. And then that friendship, of course, lasted throughout the program, and they had similar age kids. And her husband, who commanded, I think, one of Ron's flights. So they really formed this bond over their shared experience.
There's, of course, the story about Ron being kicked out of the library, and the library is now named after him. Just shows, I don't know, just how much he wanted to learn. He wanted to get those books and.
Yeah, it's interesting how you see people from a very young age. He was not going to be told what to do. He was going to make his own way. And when he was told to turn around and not be in the whites only library, at a very young age, he challenged the librarian. Of course, the librarian called his mother, called the police on him, and he stood there. He stood his ground. And now, of course, that library is named after him, as you said.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a sad story that he had to go through that. And it's a sad story that he died, but it's a nice story to see him recognized. I was wondering, with the payload specialists that were being brought in too, as well as the mission specialists and the pilots from that class and that era. What were some of the did you get any feedback about what they thought about the payload specialists coming in, especially the people like, Jake Garn and Bill Nelson, who are basically just, they're there so that the program could get their programs funded, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we allude to it a little bit in the book, but I think there was a concern about those payload specialists maybe not having good enough training or not even having the time to train. I mean, quite honestly, when you're a senator or congressman, you don't have a lot of time. Even Christa McAuliffe, they rushed her through training because she was always out and doing press. And of course, she would have wanted to train more. She was very committed to doing the best job she could. And I think Bill Nelson and Jake Garn, same thing, but there wasn't time in their schedules, also given all the press they were doing, and compounded with the idea that the shuttle itself was under tremendous pressure to launch for so many reasons. It was really tough to have those folks on board, but they made it work. Yeah. I mean, Ray, as an example, she was like, I think in her flight was the Garn flight, and he was supposed to study motion sickness. And of course, he was victim number one. And so she took over. She had to take over all of his experiments. And, there's stories like that, and of course, it's like, what would any of us do if we didn't, we're not astronauts here, and we don't have the training. They had years, two years of training before they ever stepped up to the plate. So, and these folks only had a couple of months. So there were those political ones. There were also commercial payload specialists that would maybe ride along with some of the payload that their company had developed, satellites and things like that. And there were the military guys, the military ride-alongs that were the military astronauts. So it was interesting. It was quite a mix, and the shuttle had to do everything for everyone. It had to launch commercial stuff, it had to launch military stuff, and it had to do science stuff. And as a result, the program was really under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, that's another thing I was going to mention too, just the political pressures on, the design and the usage of the space shuttle. Just seems like, trying to please everybody. It kind of, you always end up with compromises with programs like that.
Yeah. No, it's true. And right from the get-go, there were some things where, looking back, we never would have done it. Like the military gave up their Titan program. The military launches its satellites and its spyware and everything, through mostly rockets, which unmanned rockets. And they gave that program up in favor of the shuttle. In the middle of the Cold War, they had one way to space. It was the shuttle. If the shuttle wasn't working, we were all in a mess. So, I think, they really put all their eggs in one basket. The military did. And then, of course, commercial, they were selling space on the shuttle for commercial flights as well. So it was, exactly. It was all things to all people.
Some of the stuff, I think it was for the military that they had the liquid fuel upper stage. The can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, which was they called it the Death Star. I think John Young called it the Death Star, and it was something that was, it's hard to get. The shuttle can only launch so high, and to get even higher, and why you would want to get higher is because you need to get into orbits that can hit certain, or can monitor certain targets, and they need to be in certain higher orbits in order to do that. These are mostly spy satellites. So you would have to, so all the satellites would have like a little rocket on board too. And some of the rockets were more powerful than others. So it's interesting. It's like the shuttle is launching, and it's launching on top of all of this horsepower and rocket fuel, all this stuff. And then inside this payload is another rocket. They called it a bomb, like riding around with a bomb in your trunk. And the more explosive those rockets are, the more dangerous it is, and the more powerful those rockets need to be to get you into even higher orbit, the more dangerous it is. So the military, and for military payloads, and also for payloads that were science oriented, that were astronomy payloads, they had these kind of very powerful rockets, and they were very scary. And it's hard to stabilize those kinds of rockets. Yeah. Just I think a bomb in your trunk. That's a good analogy.
It's a good analogy.
You've got.
It's even scarier than that. I mean, quite honestly, I'd take the bomb in my trunk over what they did.
True. Yeah. But it's like it's a rocket in a rocket. So if one thing goes, everything goes. I think they're a lot more kind of loose with, they weren't as careful with things as they are now, as far as like just some ideas and things. I mean,
it's hard to say. I haven't looked. The current space program is got even more lofty goals, and they need more powerful rockets. And one of the challenges is getting comfortable with these. Getting comfortable with having that kind of horsepower, and so that's part of I do think that's part of the process. But, the first time you do it, or the first couple of times you do it, or the experimental process to get there, to get people comfortable with using that kind of power is, it's a learning process, and there's a lot of danger.
Yeah. I think kind of to better phrase it, I mean, it reminds me of sort of like the tile damage that they were seeing on flights like, I think it was STS-27. Where where there's just huge gouges taken out of the side of the orbiter, and it's like it hasn't caused any problems yet, so it's, I guess it's okay. It's the same thing with the burn through on the O-rings pre-Challenger, but
it is. It's a remarkable thing that they do to manage the kinds of risks that they're managing. And, one of the things that George Abbey said, or Bob Crippen said, who commanded or who was a pilot on STS-1, was that, like, look, there are hundreds of, when we go into these meetings, there are like hundreds of things that could go wrong, that could kill these people, and you're trying to manage that risk. And, I think with the O-ring issue and the tile issue, to them, these were one of many other kinds of risks they were managing. Of course, the issue with the O-rings was that if they went, the whole thing went. That was called a criticality 1 item. And, the tile wasn't exactly that, but in the right place, when you have a tile missing, it is. And so, and the foam issue, as you mentioned, on launch, foam would break off of the external orbiter, and it would hit the shuttle, and it would cause this tile damage on launch. And, that even happened on the very first launch with Bob Crippen and John Young. They came back from it, and it wasn't in an important spot, and they were able to come back, and it was a huge success. But it kept happening, and they didn't have a way to repair stuff on orbit, which they probably should have tried to stop and develop that. And the foam itself, they didn't see it as you said, it happened so many times and nothing happened until it did. And so it was a normalization of deviance, they called it, but it is one of those things. I think when you're in the program and you're an administrator in the program, it's much harder to see, given all of the risk that you face every single day.
And I'll admit, I'm speaking from 2020 hindsight too. It's like,
yeah.
So I mean,
but certainly there were things that were done that were wrong, and the system didn't work. Right.
One of the most frustrating things to me was just with Columbia, just the fact that they could have used spy satellites to look at the orbiter, and they could have, possibly done a rescue mission. It would be classic NASA, Apollo 13 thing, but it is a fair chance that it could work, and it'd be better than just crossing their fingers and I one of the things that frustrates me too, because I like astronauts, I like them to survive. The email that was sent up before reentry, or might have been earlier in the mission, I'm not sure, but during STS-107, where it's just like, yeah, we saw this foam hit, it should be fine, blah blah blah. Don't worry about it. You guys have been doing great. And it's, obviously it's paraphrased, but Um, it's frustrating that they had all those resources and didn't use them at the time.
Yeah. And that was a absolute example of the bureaucracy not working. There were people at NASA who tried to sound the alarm and they were ignored. And the report that came out, which Sally had a hand in and Anna had a hand in, was very damning about that. And it ended that report ended the program. I mean, it just did, because I think it had happened twice where the bureaucracy hadn't addressed these safety issues, hadn't tried something about the system wasn't working. And they also felt, I think that report also felt that, or those commissioners also felt that the shuttle itself was such a complex piece of machinery that it needed to be retired, and that it was also an outdated piece, vehicle. And so it was a very damning, report. And, eventually that of course happened in 2003. The shuttle was retired in 2011, but that was the beginning of the end at that point.
Yeah. As much capability as it had, it was kind of a flawed design to begin with. I think people really realized it after that. Like sticking.
It's so, oh no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like sticking the crew compartment on the side of the stack where it can be pelted by bits of foam or any kind of debris, that sort of thing.
It was so ambitious. I mean, who did we think we were? We didn't even have cell phones back then. Who did we think we were to build this thing that could like launch like a rocket, haul like a truck, and land like a plane? It was extraordinary. But also the most complicated, I mean, to our human credit, it's the most complicated, piece of machinery we've ever created. And we learned a lot by building it. And of course, now we have what we think is improved design for deep space travel, much more streamlined, less dangerous, hopefully. But a fascinating era, nevertheless.
Must have asked the TFNG astronauts about like the nuclear commercial crew launches and the way things are set up now compared to actually, NASA owning and flying their ships. They're kind of, buying seats on commercial crew vehicles. What were their thoughts on that?
Yeah, I thought, it's interesting. I actually thought that maybe they would have some trepidation about that sort of thing. But for the most part, people are really excited about where the program is headed now. And, I was just at Kennedy Space Center with Anna Fisher, and she was showing me, this is happening. Now this is happening over here. SpaceX is over here. Blue Origin launches over there. She was explaining all the new, the new structures. And I think they're excited that NASA is getting back to its mission, which mission being, to explore further into the universe, to do more experimental things, and then handing over low Earth orbit to commercial flyers like Blue Origin and SpaceX, and is focusing on return to the moon and Mars. And I think everybody's really excited about the new moonshot. And even though it's getting pushed and it's met with some delays, I think everybody's really excited and they know we're going again. And I think that's I wasn't alive for the moon landing, and I'm excited. I'm so excited to see that in my lifetime. So I think it'll bring a new energy. I think that they're thinking this is going to bring a new energy to the program.
I think if you judge by the coverage of the SLS launch back in November, I think, or December. Yeah, but back a few months, it's just there was so much coverage, so much, so many people down the Cape to see the liftoff. Can't wait for another.
It's going to be huge. It'll be huge. And I mean, we've got Artemis 2. We're going to do the slingshot thing around the moon, and then Artemis 3, hopefully. I don't know what year that's going to be, but the fact that they've promised to put a woman and a person of color on the moon. I mean, everybody's going to be watching that. It's going to be excited. And then of course, China's working on its own moon. So we've got another little space race going on over here that's brewing. And, it's all going to be I think we're all going to start to focus a little bit more on space, whereas maybe for the last decade and a half, we haven't been.
Yeah, it'd be nice because I mean, there's so much focus on STEM education now that it's nice to have another kind of focus for people because I don't know if there was a lot of I mean I know STEM programs did a lot of things like look what we did in space, and now it's like look what we're doing in space, kind of more so. Yeah, I mean, obviously the space shuttle was an important part of the space program, but like you say, the moon is gonna get everyone's ears pricked up again and kind of get everyone on the edge of their seats again. Which should be awesome.
That's the hope.
Yeah. Speaking of one thing you talked about is about talking about people of color on the moon. I was thinking that was one of the notes I was looking for. Was the comparison between Sally Ride's first flight into space and Guy Bluford's. Seemed like a very different reaction. I'm kind of jumping around. I apologize for that, but it seems like a different reaction between the two. That you wrote about.
Yeah. I mean, Sally's launch got everybody's attention, and she was on the cover of Miss Magazine and Time Magazine and Newsweek, and she did this huge tour after it was over, and she became a household name. And even now, people know who she is. I mean, kids know who she is. There's a Barbie doll after her that my little girl has. Yeah. He's very, very famous. But Guy, for whatever reason, was not afforded the same attention. And, I asked him about that. When I say he wasn't afforded the same attention, he was on the cover of Black magazines, but not Time Magazine, not Newsweek. Yeah. And, there wasn't the same attention. I mean, certainly people paid attention and the African-American community paid attention, but he didn't have the same, and he doesn't have the same recognition today. I mean, if you ask who was the first Black American in space, people often don't know, or they answer incorrectly that it was Mae Jemison. And so, part of what I wanted to do with the book is kind of tell his story, which is largely, it's not unknown. I mean, you can Google him and you can find out who he is and you can see the interviews, but it's not common knowledge, I should say. And it should be common knowledge. Anyway, and I think racism played a huge role in that at the time too. He just wasn't covered in the mainstream media in the way that you would expect. And it was very surprising, I think, when I did that research.
And so, I think there's a similar kind of dichotomy when it comes to Fred Gregory, first Black man to command a mission, and Eileen Collins.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's a really good point. And Fred is somebody else who, we talked to for the book, and just a tremendous pilot. I mean, a really great pilot. His story is about, flying in Vietnam, and he's pretty much flown every craft that exists, every spacecraft or aircraft that exists, and ran the agency too. I mean, he was deputy administrator during Columbia, and went on to be administrator, and just has had a tremendous career at the agency. Again, much less, as you said, name recognition than, let's say, Eileen Collins. For what reason? I mean, you can only imagine that it's the racism played a role.
Your Challenger chapters were, I think I learned more as much out of those chapters as I did when I read Truth Lies in O-Rings.
Thank you.
Amazing, especially the part on the salvage, which I don't think has been covered much. Can you tell me a little bit about that one? Writing that part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, that's, that part of the book, I will say, I wrote and rewrote many, many times. I didn't want to get it wrong. I didn't want to get any detail wrong because it's so important to the people who suffered in that accident to get it right.
Sure.
And I think, we didn't necessarily break any new ground in terms of the reporting of the accident itself, because there was so much scrutiny placed on it. But I think what we did differently was try to take you through moment by moment what actually happened, give you some like almost a forensic analysis of what happened on the shuttle to the people who were there. And that was important. I think that was important. And when I talked to the astronauts and we did that research, it was important to kind of understand what are the forensics of the accident so we can do better next time. And we can figure out how this whole thing works and what are the stresses on the vehicle. And then, of course, the recovery, what was, I think initially everybody thought, and even now when I ask people maybe who aren't space, who are not space people, who don't know a lot about the history, what do you think happened to Challenger? They think it vaporized. And of course it didn't vaporize. It broke up into these different parts, and the crew capsule kind of launched out of the explosion and down towards the ocean and the sea and landed in the ocean intact. Well, it was intact when it hit the ocean. Of course, it shattered when it hit the ocean, and then sunk to the bottom. And so I had read a few articles, like the Orlando Sentinel did an article and one or two other articles that kind of talked about the recovery, what it was like to find that crew capsule, but it hadn't been talked about in detail and certainly hadn't been talked about on the record. And Jim Bajan, who was the astronaut on board, who was a diver and a doctor and a very talented astronaut from the class of 1980, went on the record with us and told us a lot of the details, as did a couple of other people. And it gave this whole thing a different shape and an understanding that I had not read before and was not available before. So that is all kind of new information about those personal experiences of the recovery. And of course, it was the toughest thing. That was the toughest thing that those astronauts ever did, was to try to recover their friends, from the ocean floor.
Yeah. I mean, the scene where they actually locate the crew cabin is kind of interesting. It's kind of, you think it's one thing, but it's different. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's just, I like the it's a really interesting way to get into it and kind of be like, and get into the diver's mindset too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was the largest, since World War II was the largest recovery effort our country has ever undergone at that time. And there were lots of people, not just NASA people, as you mentioned, divers who had nothing to do with with NASA or the astronaut program, having to do these recoveries and kind of help piece it all together. So from all kinds of different agencies and different in the Navy and the Coast Guard. And so it was a remarkable recovery effort.
And unfortunately, a similar effort was required for Columbia too, which I know you talk about a bit in there. Just the discovery, discovery of pieces here and there, and just and how the remains were respectfully recovered.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
It's
yeah.
kind of. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that's right. I mean, it's the Columbia effort. Of course, that was the shuttle was shattered into so many different pieces over such a huge, over 3 states, and putting, trying to kind of wrap your head around that and the speeds at which they go and the velocity and the forces that it faced, and then the recovery effort and how many people showed up to help, volunteers that helped put everything together, including, Native American tribes. And I mean, it was just incredible. It was an incredible effort.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's something that I think, people kind of come together at the, worst possible times to show the best of humanity.
It's well said. Yeah.
Was there anything that really surprised you when you were writing this? It's kind of a stock question, but
yeah. Well, no, but it's a good question because, the shuttle program was well covered in its time. And I think the thing that surprised me the most, I wasn't expecting, as a kid of the 80s, I sort of came into this thinking the shuttle was this very safe plane, like it was like taking a jetliner or something like that. And I just always thought of it that way, and I think a lot of us did. And I think what was the most surprising is how dangerous it really was, and that it was a test vehicle. It was always a test vehicle in a way. And that the people who, especially this first class of shuttle astronauts, had to bootstrap the program into existence. And they took a lot of risks, way more than I ever would have expected. And they had way more close calls. I mean, it wasn't just Challenger and Columbia, but there were a lot of close calls along the way. And that they were extremely ballsy and brave. So I think that's, to me, was the most surprising thing about studying this program.
Is there anyone you talked to or you learned about that you didn't get to put in the book?
Oh, well, there are stories for sure I didn't get to put in the book. But, some of I really focused on the women and people of color. For the book, Ellison Onizuko, we didn't talk about, but he was the first Asian American in space. Kathy Sullivan, who was the first American spacewalker and first female American spacewalker. Shannon Lucid, who was on Mir and, had the longest duration flight at the time. We focused on those characters along with Anna and Judy Resnick and Sally Ride and Fred. There were 10 of them that we focused on in the book, but there were a lot of people that were so helpful in terms of giving us background, who are your regular old white guys. They were. Honestly, I love them just as much. That wasn't the intention of the book. The intention of the book was to talk about the sort of the people of color and the women. But Rick Hauk, who was commander during Anna Fisher's flight, had a long career at NASA. Steve Hawley, who is just fantastic, who was an astronomy PhD in astronomy. Hoot Gibson, who is just a very colorful, hilarious character, married to Ray. Anyway, there are a lot of people like that. We do talk about them in the book, but they're not the focal point of the book. But I hope people get to know them in the book as well.
You mentioned Judy Resnick too, who kind of gets overshadowed by Christa McAuliffe when it comes to Challenger. Can you tell me a little bit about her? Because I just think she's remarkable. But remarkable woman. But I never knew anything about her because it was always, especially I'm in Massachusetts. I used to work for the Framingham newspaper, which is where Christa McAuliffe was born. So it's like very Christa McAuliffe centric up here. But could you tell me a little bit about, or tell listeners a little bit about Judy?
So Judy was really terrific to research and learn about. She was the second American woman in space, first Jewish person in space. She was in the running to be the first woman in space, and arguably she and Sally were kind of neck and neck. And we talk about this in the book too, which is, Sally sort of edged out Judy largely because Judy just really didn't like the press and she really didn't like doing interviews, and she was a very private person, and that just wasn't going to work for first woman in space. You were going to be in the public eye forever, all the time. And so, but I think she had all the same skills that Sally did and went second. And she was a very talented astronaut. I think everybody that I talked to, has the highest praise for her. She had a hilarious sense of humor, which I think comes out in the book. And even in some of the chatter, it's very tragic, but in some of the chatter that leads up to Challenger, she's cracking jokes and having fun. She loved her job. Of course, she dies in Challenger. That was her second flight into space, along with Ron McNair, who was having his second flight into space. But just one of my favorite people to have learned about.
Yeah,
and she was an engineer. She was an engineer. I should actually say something about her professionally. She was a very talented engineer.
Yeah, she would probably want you to say that.
Yeah, she was like, none of that, but tell me that. Yeah, no, she was a very talented engineer and a very talented astronaut.
I didn't know that she was such a remarkable person, so it was kind of interesting. But I think you can kind of see, like, there's an interview with Tom Brokaw that's on YouTube. She does not seem all that comfortable with, with it, and it's a little sexist too, from Tommy Boy there too. But, it's interesting.
Yeah, he was asking her about her dating life, which was, what did you say to men when you say you never get away with that today? You never get, but she kept it together, and but there was a lot of that. She was attractive, and I think people made a lot of comments about her hair and what she was wearing, short pants, and she was, there were a lot of those kinds of comments you would never get away with today, but back then, that's the way it was. Yeah.
But they're still remarkable. I mean, the whole crew was remarkable. Just, so I think I can't think of anything else to ask. I don't know. Do you anything else you want to say?
You really covered the gamut. I really appreciate you taking such care and reading the book so carefully. So thank you for that.
It was great. I mean, this is like right up my alley, and a lot of fun to get I love the inside baseball stuff that it's former journalists from way back, so it's nice to I love the behind the scenes stuff. It's great.
Oh, I'm glad. It was fun to learn about.
And so I really enjoyed the book. I think it's just well crafted, lots of great information. Thank you for writing it.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for reading it. I appreciated it, and thank you for sharing it.
Today's guest has been Meredith Bagby, author of The New Guys, the historic class of astronauts that broke barriers and changed the face of space travel. I'm your host, Paul Ring, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and now YouTube as well. More great episodes are on the way, and please leave a review. They make a difference. There's a lot of ways to contact us. We're online at Launchpad Space 1 on Twitter, Launchpad Space Podcast on Facebook, and our homepage is www.launchpadshow.com. You can email us with comments or story ideas at launchpadspacepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Launchpad Space Podcast.